Here we go with number 14 for the Q&A for the Patreon and to be shared a month later publicly at the website. What we have is a brief but deep pair of questions, or set, because they sort of explode into more of them. Pablo asks, why is initiative in Circle of Hands a circle? Why not simply a line of tokens? That gives a lot of openings for discussion. First is that the term initiative is obviously a term of convenience. It arises from a prior history of game design and has undergone its own weird evolution through the course of role playing, as actually we've been uncovering for a while now. Now, what I mean is that ordering of action is obviously a variable, and initiative is an in fiction designation. And I actually find this a useful point to separate the two. They are often easily put together without any stress whatsoever. Who has the initiative? In what order? And that's the order we go in. And Circle of Hands does something a little different. Boy, it's just all these doors are opening. Okay, so what's the context? We have all sorts of different ways, obviously. One way that I think has been sadly lost historically is what I see in the original RuneQuest. We've discussed this for a long time, which is this idea that we see how long all the stated actions will take, and then we basically resolve the earliest of the next one. Using this strike rank thing. And fundamental to that is that once your action is completed, you must state your next action and its time is calculated. So therefore, we can see how it stands relative to all the other ones that are coming down the pike. So when everybody's doing this, you get this remarkable sense of everyone in motion all the time, including changing up in the middle. So you have stated something, and we know how many strike ranks it will take until you get there. But things have happened, and you were halfway there. Other actions have been taken. Things are different, and you say, oh, forget that. I'm going to go do this other thing. Well, given where your character is right at that moment, which is midway to some fraction of getting to where and what you said you were going to do, figure out where they are and say, oh, well, all right, in that case, it'll take this many. And so we basically give you a new number and see how that relates to all the ones that we knew about. It's really dynamic and exciting. Now, we also have these interesting kind of mob resolutions. I've talked a lot about this with Tunnels and Trolls in terms of there is a collective activity, which is kind of a default, and then we have individual activities within it to a certain extent. How the individual actions are related to the collective action is unconstructed, but I actually think that's more functional than some sort of careful construction of ordering. Those we can think of as two of the early ones. Now, for further context, there's also these side-based things, which you see both in Holmes' Dungeons and Dragons and also in Melee, which is a notion of a side has initiative over the other side. And everybody on that winning side operates, kind of deploys as a unit. Their collective tactics or their collective motion relative to one another, everything descends upon the other side. Whether this applies to movement alone, as it does in Melee, or whether we now apply that concept to different phases like missiles, magic, and melee, magic, missiles, melee, or whatever, those are various further design considerations. But the idea is that we're looking at two sides of a battle, sort of like in that mob role thing. But then we uh, we see which one as a team gets to go, and everybody gets to go in some way. But the team that won initiative kind of gets the edge up in terms of movement for sure, and often individual activity, depending on the game. But what we don't see is something that seems to develop at the tables, and I really don't know what text does it first. And it so happens that in playing Villains and Vigilantes right now, I'm looking at the earliest text that I'm thinking about, anyway, that I can think of off the top of my head, in which everybody rolls a number, and in this case adds their agility, and then that basically sets up our order of action from highest to lowest, and we just go in that order. And in the case of Villains and Vigilantes, and in most of the games that I played back then that had anything like this is redone every single turn. By the time I was kind of done with playing Dungeons and Dragons, the first time that felt that way in the early 80s, um, I found that it had become habit among people. And even though it's not really anywhere in the rules, but it became a habit that we would all roll something and then just go in that order of across all the characters involved. But we always re-rolled at the beginning of a round, and it always struck me as odd later coming back to discover that you would roll for such a thing once, and then that was fixed for this particular encounter. I'm not saying that's bad or anything, but we didn't do it, or I never encountered that until much later. Okay, hopefully that provides all this context, because Circle of Hands splits order and initiative. It does something a little different, drawing on some of these things. In the first case, you line everybody up in the encounter by their quickness, and that just seems very straightforward. Okay, so we're going in that order. That's how it works, huh? Well, there are several different things that change that up. If your character has been drawn into a clash by somebody operating in the go position, then unless you can defend yourself and stay unharmed without attacking in the middle of that clash, then you will be pulled to the end of the line, or along with that person, and in fact behind them. So basically, a person can be kept busy by people, piling onto them and keeping them, unless they can manage to get through with, maintain their position, defend themselves in such a way to maintain their position, they're going to lose their place in line. And also, you may also pump, as I would call it, brawn, actually doing fatigue damage to yourself to get yourself to the front of the line. And there's no limit on that. So if people just start pumping to, get themselves to the front of the line, that is fine. So that ordering gets changed up in a variety of ways all the time in this game. And Pablo's question is a good one, that hypothetically one could just make a line of little pawns or something and just treat the front and the back as what they are. And here I go and say, no, you should get a coaster or something similar to a coaster, about that big or something. And then you put little tokens around it, know which, treat it like a clock, where 12 o'clock is, and the go position is 3 o'clock, and they kind of go across the top. So therefore, the character who just acted on 3 o'clock, you just kind of scoot them around clockwise until they come to the end of the line. Is this merely a gimmick? Is it just a thoroughly, am I basically imposing the symbology of something called the circle, for something that anybody could do quite straightforwardly with a little line of pawns? If I sold little, metal die stamped, discs to use for this purpose, is that just me? Would that be, me being cute and profiteering? Clever, and I should, from the standpoint of any, sensible business person, but, I never get off the mark quite successfully to do such things. Well, anyway, uh, I don't think it's just a gimmick. And the reason for that may or may not be understandable, or it doesn't invite agreement, which is pure experience with the game. I find that if we treat it as a line, that people stop paying attention to the little pawns entirely, and they stop paying attention to the options. They basically don't do it. They don't pump brawn to jump in front. We forget that, somebody who had been through this clash and had attacked back in the middle of the clash or whatever, we forget that they go, to the end as well. Basically, it cognitively doesn't click. Whereas if I do this, people who are playing the game for the very first time, as soon as they see the setup and they see one or two people take their actions, they've got it. And all the options seem to be fully in their heads. People are saying, I'm pumping a brawn, or people say, oh, well, he doesn't go back to the line. He keeps his place in line, the way that they fought. And it makes sense to people. So perhaps something about that circular setup is helping, or more accurately, I know something about that circular setup helps this to happen, because I've seen the converse so thoroughly. Now, who knows? Who's ever watching this, maybe your group is different. Maybe you use little pawns in a line and it works fine. Well, good for you. But I didn't see that. And so that's why, instead of just saying in order of quickness, in order of quickness, in order of quickness, because if I did that, then everybody just bakes it into their head. What's the quickness? And that's what sets it in their head. And that seems so immutable once set. You see, if we just put them in order of quickness around that little circle, and we never refer to quickness again because we don't have to, then nobody kind of bakes in that number as, the ordering mechanism. So that's what happened with it, because clashes are actually the most important aspect of confrontations in the game. This also relates to sorcerer. See what I mean? All these different doors are opening. And it's no surprise. I mean, I was playing Magic the Gathering in the early 90s, along with some other people. I'm given to understand some people were doing this. And one thing that excited us was the notion that when you had two characters enter into physical combat, then, they dealt damage to one another. And this is no surprise to any number, of wargamers. After all, Magic the Gathering is a wargame in your pocket. And I realized that we had somehow fallen out of that. And I was thinking about role-playing games in which that was and wasn't the case. And I was surprised at how few had that in there. And I could be wrong. I don't know. But things like attacks of opportunity, that you got a free attack when somebody passed you and stuff like that, at least it had never crossed my experience as a role player. And I have no idea when maybe it's been there from the beginning from some other game, but I didn't see it or know about it. Few of us thought in terms of this reactivity in the middle of someone else's go. In regard to sorcerer, therefore, especially with the confrontational dice mechanics, it seemed to me important. The earliest design of sorcerer actually did have, some borked way of, having the dice confront one another, and if you attack somebody, there was a chance it was coming back in on you. And I ultimately gave that up once we started doing the role in the beginning, because that created the dynamism that I was looking for. Took away the whole idea of a fixed order in the first place, and basically took away order entirely in favor of initiative only.